The Mafia boss works a miracle on a bedridden woman. Her new hairstyle and look stun the event. That single sentence traveled through the streets of Brooklyn like wildfire in the summer of 2022, and nobody who heard it could quite believe what it meant. But this story, the real story behind those words, is far more complex, far more emotional, and far more human than any headline could ever capture. It begins not in a glamorous penthouse or a shady back room, but in a small, dimly lit bedroom on the second floor of a crumbling brownstone in Red Hook, where a woman named Clara Mancini had not left her bed in over 14 months. Clara Mancini was 53 years old, and there was a time when her name meant something in the neighborhood. She had been a seamstress, one of the best in South Brooklyn, known for her hand-stitched wedding dresses that made brides look like they had stepped out of a painting from another century. Her fingers moved with a precision that machines could never replicate, and her tiny shop on Van Brunt Street had been a landmark for nearly 2 decades. Women came from as far as Staten Island and even Manhattan to have Clara measure them, to feel her careful hands pin fabric against their skin, to hear her say in that warm, raspy voice of hers, "Every woman deserves to feel like the most beautiful version of herself at least once in her life." But that was before the fall. It happened on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021. Clara had been carrying a bolt of ivory silk down the narrow staircase at the back of her shop when her left foot caught the edge of a loose step. She tumbled forward, her body twisting in a way that no 52-year-old frame was designed to twist, and she landed at the bottom with a sound that her assistant, a young woman named Dina, would never forget. The doctors at NYU Langone said the damage was extensive. 3 fractured vertebrae, a shattered left hip, nerve damage that sent electric jolts of pain down both legs whenever she tried to move. They performed 2 surgeries over the next 5 weeks, inserted metal rods and screws, and told her that recovery would be long and uncertain. Long and uncertain turned out to be an understatement. Months passed. Clara did her physical therapy at first, gritting her teeth through every agonizing session, but progress was painfully slow. The pain never fully subsided. The medications made her foggy, disconnected from the world, and the fog became a kind of prison of its own. By the 6-month mark, she had stopped going to therapy altogether. By the 9th month, she had stopped leaving the apartment. By the time a full year had passed since the fall, Clara Mancini had become a ghost in her own home. A woman who existed only within the 4 walls of her small bedroom, the curtains perpetually drawn, the television murmuring in the background like a companion that never demanded anything of her. Her daughter, Lucia, who was 28 and worked as a paralegal in downtown Manhattan, came by every evening after work. She would bring groceries, cook dinner, sit on the edge of her mother's bed, and try to coax conversation out of a woman who seemed to have lost interest in the act of living. Lucia would brush her mother's hair sometimes, gently working through the tangles that had accumulated during another day of stillness, and Clara would stare at the ceiling with eyes that looked like they belonged to someone much older, someone who had already made peace with the idea that life had nothing left to offer. "Mom, you have to try," Lucia would say, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to stay strong. "You can't just stay here forever." And Clara would turn her head slightly toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights seeped through the curtains, and she would whisper, "I'm tired, Lucia. I'm just so tired." The neighborhood noticed, of course. Red Hook was that kind of place. Small enough that people still talked, still cared, still kept track of who was doing well and who was not. The old Italian families who had been there for generations, the newer residents who had moved in during the gentrification wave, even the kids who hung out at Coffee Park. They all knew about Clara. They would ask Lucia when they saw her at the bodega or walking to the bus stop, "How's your mother doing?" And Lucia would force a smile and say, "She's getting there," even though they all knew she was not getting anywhere at all. Clara's shop had closed, of course. Dina had tried to keep it going for a few months, but without Clara's hands, without her eye, without the magic she brought to every stitch, the orders dried up. The landlord eventually rented the space to a craft beer taproom, and just like that, 20 years of Clara's life was erased from the street, replaced by chalkboard menus and Edison bulbs. But what nobody in the neighborhood knew, what Lucia herself barely understood, was that Clara's retreat from the world was not just about the physical pain. It was about something deeper, something she had never spoken about to anyone. It was about the fact that when Clara looked in the mirror, on the rare occasions she allowed herself to look, she did not recognize the woman staring back at her. The woman in the mirror had sunken cheeks and dull skin and hair that had gone from a rich chestnut brown to a lifeless grey, thin and brittle, and falling out in clumps against the pillow. The woman in the mirror looked defeated, and Clara, who had spent her entire adult life helping other women feel beautiful, could not bear the cruelty of her own reflection. She had always believed that beauty was not about vanity. It was about dignity. It was about the way a woman carried herself when she knew she looked her best, the quiet confidence that came from feeling put together, the armor that a good appearance provided against a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. And, now that armor was gone, stripped away by pain and isolation and time, and Clara felt exposed in a way that made her want to shrink into the mattress and disappear completely. This was the state of things when a man named Vincent Corsetti entered the picture. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody, not Clara, not Lucia, not anyone in Red Hook, could have predicted. Now, before we go any further, check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one, stories that will make you feel something real, something deep, they come here every single week and you do not want to miss a single one. Vincent Corsetti was 61 years old, and in certain circles his name carried a weight that could silence a room. He was a businessman. That was the word he used, and it was technically accurate, though it left out a great deal. Vincent owned a string of restaurants across Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, a construction company, a waste management firm, and several real estate holdings that generated enough passive income to fund a small country. On paper, he was a successful Italian-American entrepreneur, a pillar of the community who donated generously to local charities and attended Sunday Mass at Our Lady of Grace without fail. But everybody knew, not the specifics perhaps, not the details of the meetings that happened in the private dining room at the back of his flagship restaurant on Court Street, not the exact nature of the arrangements he had with certain union officials and city inspectors, not the precise mechanics of how money moved through his various enterprises. But everybody knew that Vincent Corsetti was a man of influence, a man whose requests were not really requests at all, a man who existed in that shadowy space between legitimate business and something far more complex. He had been born in Bensonhurst to Sicilian immigrants, had grown up in a world where loyalty was the highest virtue and betrayal was the lowest sin, and had built his empire through a combination of sharp intelligence, ruthless pragmatism, and an almost theatrical sense of personal style. Even now, in his 60s, Vincent dressed impeccably. Custom suits from a tailor in Williamsburg, silk ties in deep jewel tones, shoes polished to a mirror shine. His silver hair was always perfectly combed back from his forehead, and his dark eyes had a way of looking at people that made them feel simultaneously seen and assessed. He was not a cruel man. That was the thing that complicated the narrative, the thing that made it impossible to simply categorize him as a villain. Vincent had a code, and he lived by it with a rigidity that bordered on religious devotion. He took care of the people in his orbit. When the son of one of his restaurant managers needed surgery, Vincent paid for it without being asked and never mentioned it again. When a fire destroyed a laundromat on Columbia Street, he personally organized the rebuilding, effort, and covered the costs that insurance did not. He remembered names, birthdays, anniversaries. He sent flowers to widows and fruit baskets to new mothers. He was, in the parlance of another era, a patron, a man who saw himself as a guardian of his community, even if the methods by which he maintained that guardianship were not always entirely legal. His wife, Angela, had passed away 6 years earlier from a swift and merciless illness that took her in just 3 months. They had been married for 34 years, and her death had cracked something open inside Vincent that he had never been able to close again. He had no children. Angela had not been able to conceive, and they had decided together not to pursue other options, choosing instead to pour their parental energy into the extended family of nieces, nephews, and community members who orbited their lives. After Angela's death, Vincent had become quieter, more introspective, more prone to long silences in which he seemed to be carrying on a conversation with someone who was no longer there. He had known Clara Mancini for decades. Not well. They were not close friends, not family, but in the way that people in a tight-knit community know each other. He had seen her at neighborhood events, had nodded to her at church, had once sent his niece to her shop for a communion dress that Clara had made so exquisite that the girl cried when she put it on. Vincent remembered that. He remembered the way Clara had knelt down, taken the girl's hands and said, "You look like an angel, sweetheart." It was a small moment, the kind that most people would forget, but Vincent had a memory that filed away kindness the way other people filed away debts. When he heard that Clara had been bedridden for over a year, that she had essentially given up, that she was wasting away in a dark room while her daughter worked herself to exhaustion, trying to keep everything together, he felt something tighten in his chest. It was the same feeling he had when Angela was fading, that helpless rage at watching someone you cared about lose their grip on the world. The catalyst for what happened next came in the form of an event. Every year in late September, the Red Hook Community Association hosted what they called the Harvest Gala, a fundraising dinner held in a restored warehouse on the waterfront. It was an elegant affair. White tablecloths, string quartet, locally sourced menu, silent auction. The proceeds went to various neighborhood causes, youth programs, senior services, infrastructure improvements. Vincent was always the honorary chairman and the largest donor. He took the event seriously, not because he cared about the social prestige, but because he genuinely believed in the idea that a community was only as strong as its willingness to look after its weakest members. This year, the gala was scheduled for September 24th, and as the planning committee began their preparations in early August, Vincent had an idea. It came to him one evening as he sat alone in his study, a glass of red wine in his hand and a photograph of Angela on the desk in front of him. Angela had been beautiful, not in the conventional magazine cover way, but in a way that radiated warmth and life. She had always taken great care with her appearance, not out of vanity, but out of self-respect, and Vincent had loved watching her get ready for events like the gala, the ritual of choosing a dress, doing her hair, applying her makeup with the precision of an artist. He thought of Clara, alone in that dark room, and he thought of Angela, and something clicked into place. He picked up his phone and called his most trusted associate, a man named Tommy Delaney, who had worked for him for over 20 years, and who functioned as a combination of personal assistant, advisor, and liaison with the outside world. "Tommy," Vincent said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that was as natural to him as breathing. "I need you to find me the best hairstylist and makeup artist in New York City, and I mean the best. Not some celebrity with an Instagram following, someone who can look at a woman who has lost everything and make her feel like she has something again." Tommy, who had learned long ago not to ask questions, when Vincent had that particular tone in his voice, simply said, "I'll have names for you by morning." "One more thing," Vincent added. "I want to talk to Clara Mancini's daughter, Lucia. Set up a meeting, make it respectful. This is not a summons, it's an invitation." Lucia Mancini had never met Vincent Corsetti in person, though she had grown up hearing his name spoken in the kind of hushed, respectful tones that people in Red Hook reserved for weather events and certain prominent figures. When Tommy Delaney called her at work and explained, in his careful, courteous way, that Mr. Corsetti would like to meet with her to discuss something regarding her mother, Lucia's first instinct was fear. Not because she thought Vincent meant her harm, she knew enough about him to know that he did not operate that way, but because the idea that someone so powerful had taken an interest in her family's situation made her feel vulnerable in a way she could not quite articulate. They met at a small cafe on Atlantic Avenue, a neutral space that Tommy had chosen specifically to put Lucia at ease. Vincent was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of espresso, wearing a charcoal suit and a silk pocket square the color of burgundy. He stood when she entered, and Lucia was struck by how ordinary he seemed up close, not menacing, not intimidating, just a well-dressed older man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Lucia," he said, pulling out her chair for her. "Thank you for coming. I know this is unusual." "It is," she admitted, sitting down and folding her hands in her lap to stop them from trembling. "I'm not sure what this is, sir, about." Vincent leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment, not in a predatory way, but with the assessing gaze of a man who was trying to figure out the best way to say something important. "I knew your mother," he began. "Not well, but enough. She made a communion dress for my niece years ago. Beautiful work. Your mother has a gift." "Had," Lucia corrected, and then immediately wished she had not said it, because the word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Vincent nodded slowly. "I heard about what happened, the fall, the surgeries, and I heard that she has not been herself." Lucia looked down at the table. "She doesn't leave her bed. She barely eats. She won't see anyone. I've tried everything. Therapy, doctors, medication. She just gave up." "May I ask you something personal?" Vincent said, leaning forward slightly. Lucia nodded. "When was the last time your mother felt beautiful?" The question caught Lucia off guard. She opened her mouth to respond and then closed it again, because the honest answer was that she could not remember. Not since before the fall. Not since before the world had narrowed to the size of a bedroom and the shape of a hospital gown. "I don't know," she whispered. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "The Harvest Gala is in 7 weeks," he said. "I would like to bring your mother as my guest of honor. But before that, I want to give her something. I want to bring the best hairstylist, the best makeup artist, the best fashion consultant in the city to her home. I want to give her a day where she is not a patient, not an invalid, not a woman who has been forgotten. I want to give her a day where she is Clara Mancini again." Lucia stared at the envelope and then at Vincent. "Why?" she asked, and her voice cracked on the word. Vincent was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had expected, carrying a weight of personal loss that she recognized instantly. "Because my wife spent the last months of her life in a bed, just like your mother. And I watched her fade, not just physically. I watched the light go out of her eyes, the pride drain out of her face. And I didn't know what to do. I was a man who could move mountains, who could make things happen with a phone call, and I couldn't figure out how to give my own wife back her sense of self." He paused, and Lucia saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of old pain that he quickly brought under control. "I failed, Angela. I won't pretend otherwise. But your mother is still here, Lucia. She is still alive. And as long as she is alive, there is still something that can be done." Lucia picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a card with the details of the gala, date, time, location, and behind it a check. She looked at the amount and her eyes widened. "That's to cover any medical equipment, transportation, clothing, whatever your mother needs to be comfortable," Vincent said. "I've already arranged for the stylist and the rest of the team. All I need is your permission, and hers." "She'll say no," Lucia said immediately. "She won't even talk about leaving the house." "Then we don't start there," Vincent replied, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "We start smaller. We start with a visit. Just someone to talk to her, to show her what's possible. We let her set the pace. No pressure, no expectations, just an open door." Lucia looked at this man, this supposed boss of bosses, this figure of whispered legend and neighborhood mythology. And she saw something she had not expected to see. She saw a man who understood grief, who understood the way it could hollow a person out from the inside, and who believed, against all evidence, that a hollowed-out person could be filled again. "Okay," she said. "I'll talk to her." If this story is making you feel something, right now type in the comments, "Everyone deserves to feel beautiful again." Drop that right now, because Clara's journey is just beginning, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Convincing Clara was not easy. In fact, the first attempt was a complete failure. Lucia broached the subject that same evening, sitting on the edge of her mother's bed as she always did, peeling an orange and placing the segments on a small plate within Clara's reach. She explained Vincent's offer carefully, framing it as casually as she could, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a powerful neighborhood figure to want to treat a bedridden seamstress to a day of pampering. Clara listened with her eyes closed, and when Lucia finished, she said, "No." "Mom, I said no, Lucia. I'm not some charity case. I'm not going to let some man parade me around like a broken doll he fixed. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Lucia hesitated. "He lost his wife, Mom. He told me about it. I think he sees something in your situation that reminds him of her. I think he just wants to help." Clara opened her eyes and looked at her daughter with an expression that was equal parts tenderness and exhaustion. "I appreciate that you're trying, I really do, but I can't. Look at me, Lucia." She gestured weakly at herself, at the oversized t-shirt she had been wearing for 3 days, at the thinning hair spread across the pillow, at the hands that had once created works of art and now lay limp at her sides. "This is who I am now, and no hairstylist in the world is going to change that." Lucia did not argue. She had learned that arguing with her mother was like arguing with a wall. It accomplished nothing except making you feel worse. So she kissed Clara's forehead, turned off the lamp and left the room. But she did not give up, and neither did Vincent. Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent deployed a strategy that revealed a side of him that most people never saw. A patience and emotional intelligence that seemed at odds with the decisive, commanding persona he projected in his business dealings. He did not push. He did not send Clara gifts or flowers or persuasive messages. Instead, he sent people. The first was his niece, the same girl, now a woman of 24 named Sophia, for whom Clara had made the communion dress all those years ago. Sophia showed up at Clara's door one afternoon with a container of homemade cannoli and a disarming smile, and when Lucia let her in, she went straight to Clara's room and sat down without asking permission. "Mrs. Mancini," she said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you made my communion dress when I was 8. My grandmother still has it in her closet, wrapped in tissue paper like it's a Chanel original." Clara blinked. A flicker of something, recognition maybe, or the ghost of pride, crossed her face. "The one with the hand-embroidered daisies along the hem?" "That's the one. I cried when I put it on. Do you remember?" "I remember," Clara said quietly. "You looked beautiful." "I felt beautiful," Sophia corrected, "and I've never forgotten that feeling, not once in 16 years. They talked for an hour. Sophia did most of the talking, sharing stories about her life, her job at a publishing house, her terrible apartment in Bushwick, her ongoing war with a pigeon that had taken up residence on her fire escape. She was funny and warm and effortlessly charming, and by the end of the visit, Clara was sitting up slightly in bed, and there was something in her eyes that Lucia, watching from the doorway, had not seen in over a year. It was not happiness exactly. It was closer to curiosity, a small, fragile crack in the wall she had built around herself. The second visitor came 3 days later. Her name was Renata Voss, and she was, as Tommy Delaney had promised, one of the best hairstylists in New York City. She had worked with Broadway performers, fashion designers, and socialites, but her real passion, the thing that lit up her face when she talked about it, was working with women who had been through difficult times. She had spent years volunteering at shelters and recovery centers, helping women who had been through hell to see themselves in a new light, and she brought to her work a combination of technical skill and emotional sensitivity that was rare and genuine. Vincent had briefed Renata personally, sitting across from her in his study and explaining Clara's situation with a level of detail and care that surprised even Tommy. "This is not a job," Vincent had told her. "This is a mission, and I need you to approach it with everything you have." Renata arrived at Clara's apartment with nothing more than a small bag and an easy smile. She was in her mid-40s with short, silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that looked like it had laughed a lot and cried a lot, and was better for both. She did not mention hair or makeup or the gala. She simply sat beside Clara's bed and started talking. "I heard you were a seamstress," Renata said. "One of the great ones." "I was," Clara said, using the past tense again like a shield. "You know, I think what we do is similar," Renata said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "We take something, fabric for you, hair for me, and we try to bring out what's already there. We don't create beauty. We reveal it." Clara looked at her with an expression that hovered between skepticism and interest. "That's a nice philosophy." "It's not philosophy, it's practice. I've sat with women who hadn't looked in a mirror in months, sometimes years, women who believed they were invisible. And every single time, when I was done, when they finally looked at themselves, really looked, they saw something they had forgotten was there. And what's that? Themselves." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My hair is a disaster." Renata smiled. "I've seen worse, trust me." "I doubt that." There was a woman in the Bronx who had been cutting her own hair with kitchen scissors for 2 years. She looked like a hedgehog in a windstorm, and by the time I was done with her, she looked like she belonged on a magazine cover. The faintest ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of Clara's mouth. It was so small that anyone else might have missed it, but Renata did not miss it. She had spent her career learning to read faces the way musicians read sheet music, and she knew that smile, fragile, involuntary. Surprised was the opening she needed. "I'm not saying yes to anything," Clara said firmly. "I'm not asking you to say yes to anything," Renata replied. "I'm just saying hello, and I'm saying that whenever you're ready, and only when you're ready, I'll be here." She left her business card on the nightstand and departed without another word. It took 9 more days. 9 days of Lucia, watching her mother glance at that business card, sometimes picking it up and turning it over in her fingers, then putting it back down. 9 days of Clara lying in the dark, replaying conversations in her head, Sophia's story about the communion dress, Renata's words about revealing what was already there, and underneath it all, the question that Vincent Corsetti had posed through his actions, if not his words. What if you are not as lost as you think you are? On the 10th day, Clara called Lucia into her room. "Call that woman," she said. "The hairstylist." "Renata?" "Yes." Clara swallowed hard, and Lucia could see the effort it took for her to say the next words, the way they scraped against every instinct that had kept her immobilized for the past 14 months. "Tell her I want to try." Lucia did not cry, although she wanted to. She simply nodded, squeezed her mother's hand and left the room to make the call. The next 6 weeks unfolded like a carefully choreographed operation, and in many ways, that is exactly what it was. Vincent orchestrated it with the same precision and attention to detail that he brought to every significant undertaking in his life, delegating tasks, coordinating schedules, and checking in regularly with Lucia to ensure that everything was moving at a pace Clara could handle. The first step was physical. Vincent arranged for a home physical therapist, a patient, soft-spoken man named Dr. James Okafor, to visit Clara 3 times a week. Dr. Okafor did not storm in with aggressive rehabilitation plans or motivational speeches. He started with gentle stretches, range of motion exercises, small movements that Clara could manage without triggering the worst of her pain. He explained everything he was doing and why, treated her like a partner in the process rather than a patient to be managed, and celebrated every small victory with quiet sincerity. "You lifted your left arm 2 inches higher than last week," he would say, and Clara would look at him like he was insane for being excited about 2 inches. But somewhere deep down, she registered the progress. Alongside the physical therapy, Renata began her work. She visited Clara twice a week, and the first several sessions had nothing to do with hair or makeup. They were about trust. Renata sat with Clara and talked about her own life, about her career, about the women she had worked with. She shared stories of transformation that were honest and unglamorous, stories that acknowledged how hard it was to care about your appearance when everything else in your life was falling apart, and how caring about it anyway was not vanity, but an act of defiance. When the world knocks you down, Renata said one afternoon, running her fingers gently through Clara's thinning hair to assess its condition, it wants you to stay down. It wants you to stop caring. And the most powerful thing you can do, the most rebellious, the most courageous thing, is to look in the mirror and say, I'm still here, and I still matter. Clara listened. She did not always respond, but she listened. Gradually, Renata introduced practical elements. She brought specialized shampoos and treatments designed to strengthen damaged hair and promote new growth. She gave Clara scalp massages that were so soothing that Clara would close her eyes and, for a few minutes, forget about the pain in her back and hips. She showed Clara photographs of different hairstyles that might work with her current hair texture and length, explaining the reasoning behind each one with the expertise of someone who truly understood the relationship between a woman's hair and her sense of identity. Hair is not just hair, Renata explained. It's how we frame our face to the world. It's the first thing people see, and it shapes how they perceive us, and more importantly, how we perceive ourselves. When a woman feels good about her hair, she stands taller, she speaks louder, she takes up more space. And that is what I want for you, Clara. I want you to take up space again. Vincent, meanwhile, handled the wardrobe. He enlisted the help of a fashion consultant named Marcus Chen, a discreet and perceptive young man who had dressed everyone from Broadway stars to UN diplomats and who approached the task with a sensitivity that impressed even Vincent. Marcus visited Clara's apartment, took careful measurements while she sat on the edge of her bed, the first time she had sat upright for an extended period in months, and asked her questions that went far beyond fabric preferences and color palettes. "Tell me about a time you felt powerful," Marcus said, his pencil poised over a sketch pad. Clara thought about it for a surprisingly long time. "There was a gala," she said slowly. "Years ago. I was in my 30s. I wore a deep emerald dress that I had made myself, with a neckline that was just low enough to be interesting but not enough to be obvious. My hair was done up in a loose twist, and I wore my mother's pearl earrings. When I walked into that room..." She trailed off, and her eyes grew distant with the memory. Every head turned, not because I was the most beautiful woman there, I wasn't, but because I looked like I belonged, like I had every right to be exactly where I was. Marcus smiled and began sketching. "Emerald," he said. "We're going with emerald." The dress he designed for Clara was a masterpiece of thoughtful engineering. It was floor-length, made of a deep emerald silk that caught the light like water, with a fitted bodice that was structured enough to provide support for her weakened frame, but draped elegantly enough to give the illusion of effortless grace. The sleeves were 3/4 length, concealing the medical port on her left arm, where she still received pain management treatments. The back featured a subtle panel of stretch fabric that accommodated the brace she would need to wear underneath. It was, in every way, a garment designed for a woman in Clara's specific situation, and yet it looked like nothing less than a custom couture gown. When Marcus brought the finished dress to Clara's apartment for the first fitting, she touched the fabric with trembling fingers and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then she looked up at him, with eyes that were bright with tears, and said, "It feels like something I would have made." "That," Marcus replied gently, "is the highest compliment I have ever received." As the weeks progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Clara started getting out of bed more frequently. At first it was just to walk to the bathroom and back, leaning heavily on a walker, her jaw clenched against the pain. Then it was to the living room, where she would sit by the window and watch the street below, reacquainting herself with the rhythm of the neighborhood she had abandoned. Then, one afternoon that Lucia would later describe as the most important afternoon of the entire ordeal, Clara walked to the kitchen, sat down at the table and said, "I want real food, not that microwave stuff. Cook me something." Lucia made her mother's favorite, pasta with fresh tomato sauce and basil from the tiny herb garden on the fire escape that Lucia had been maintaining in secret, hoping for exactly this moment. They sat together at the kitchen table and ate, and Clara remarked that the basil was getting leggy and needed to be pinched back, And Lucia laughed and cried at the same time because her mother was noticing things again, caring about things again, being in the world again. 2 weeks before the gala, Renata arrived for what she called the big session. She brought a portable salon setup, professional-grade tools, products, mirrors, and spent an entire afternoon working on Clara's hair. She had been nurturing it for weeks, and the results were significant. The thinning had slowed and new growth was coming in, not the dull grey it had been, but a softer, more luminous silver that Renata had coaxed out with careful toning and treatment. "We're not going to fight the grey," Renata told Clara as she worked. "We're going to own it. Silver is stunning on you, it brings out your eyes." She cut Clara's hair into a sophisticated style, shorter than Clara had worn it in years, with soft layers that framed her face and a side-swept fringe that drew attention to her still striking bone structure. She worked with quiet concentration, and Clara sat in silence, watching strands of hair fall to the floor and feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember a stirring of something that she tentatively identified as hope. When Renata finally turned the mirror around, Clara looked at herself for a long, long time. "I look," she began, and then stopped. Her hand went to her face, touching her cheek as though confirming that the woman in the mirror was real. "I look like someone I used to know." "You look like yourself," Renata said. "You look like Clara Mancini." And Clara, for the first time in 14 months, smiled. Not a ghost of a smile, not a polite flicker, but a real, full, unguarded smile that transformed her entire face and made Lucia, standing in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth, realize that her mother had not disappeared after all. She had just been hiding. And now, slowly, carefully, beautifully, she was coming back. During the final week of preparation, Vincent visited Clara in person for the first time. He came alone, without Tommy, without ceremony, just a man in a well-cut suit carrying a small box wrapped in gold. Paper. Lucia let him in and showed him to Clara's room, where Clara was sitting in a chair by the window, not in bed, in a chair, with her newly styled hair and a cardigan draped over her shoulders. Vincent stood in the doorway for a moment, and something passed across his face that was too quick and too complex for anyone but Clara to catch. It was recognition, not of her specifically, but of a situation. A woman in a room, recovering, holding on. He had seen this before. He had lived it. Before. "Clara," he said, and his voice was warm. "You look wonderful." "You're a flatterer," she said, but she was pleased. He came into the room and sat down across from her, placing the gold box on the small table between them. "I want you to know," he said, "that what we're doing here, the gala, the dress, all of it, this is not charity. This is not pity. This is respect. You spent your life making other people feel special. You earned this." Clara studied him with the shrewd, assessing gaze of a woman who had spent decades reading people through the intimacy of measuring their bodies. "Why are you really doing this, Vincent?" she asked, using his first name for the first time, a liberty that would have been unthinkable in other circumstances, but felt natural in this small sunlit room. Vincent was quiet for a moment. "Because I had power," he said finally. "I had money, connections, influence, and when the person I loved most in the world was fading away in front of me, I didn't use any of it. I told myself there was nothing I could do, and maybe that was true, maybe there wasn't, but I never tried. And that—" His voice caught just barely, a crack in the armor that he sealed almost instantly. "That is something I live with every day." He pushed the gold box toward her. "Open it." Inside, nestled in a bed of white velvet, was a pair of pearl earrings. Not just any pearls, they were luminous, perfectly matched, with a warm, rosy undertone that seemed to glow with an inner light. "They were Angela's," Vincent said. "She wore them to our last gala together. She would have wanted you to have them." Clara looked at the earrings, then at Vincent, and in that moment, something passed between them that was not romantic, not transactional, not reducible to any simple category. It was an understanding between two people who had both been brought to their knees by life and who had both, in their different ways, chosen to get back up. "Thank you," Clara said. And the two words carried the weight of everything she could not say, the gratitude, the surprise, the cautious, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, the world still had room for someone like her. September 24th arrived wrapped in one of those perfect New York autumn evenings, the air crisp and clean, the sky a deepening blue streaked with gold and amber, the city humming with that particular energy that only comes when summer finally surrenders and something new begins. The harvest. Gala was being held at Liberty Warehouse, a beautifully restored industrial space on the Red Hook waterfront with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Statue of Liberty and the glittering expanse of New York Harbor. The planning committee had outdone themselves. The interior was draped in warm amber lighting, long tables set with white linen and autumn floral arrangements, a string quartet playing softly in one corner, and a subtle buzz of anticipation that went beyond the usual pre-event excitement. Word had gotten around. Not the specifics, because Vincent had been characteristically tight-lipped about the details, but the general sense that something special was going to happen tonight. Something involving Clara Mancini. The guests began arriving around 7. There were the usual faces, neighborhood business owners, local politicians, teachers, firefighters, the diverse cross-section of Red Hook that came together for this event every year. There were also some faces that were less usual, friends of Vincent's from other parts of the city, people whose names appeared in newspapers and whose presence at a neighborhood gala lent it an air of significance that the community found both exciting and slightly unsettling. Vincent was there early, of course, standing near the entrance in a midnight blue suit with a silver tie, greeting guests with handshakes and kisses on cheeks, and that particular combination of warmth and authority that was uniquely his. Tommy stood a few steps behind him, eyes moving constantly, a human radar scanning for problems before they could materialize. Lucia arrived at 7:15, slipping through a side entrance that Vincent had arranged to avoid the crowd. She was nervous, her hands were shaking, and she had changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple navy dress that she hoped was appropriate for the occasion. She found Tommy and gave him a small nod. "She's in the car," Lucia said. "She's ready, but she's scared." Tommy relayed the message to Vincent, who excused himself from a conversation with a city council member and walked calmly to the side entrance. He stepped outside into the cool evening air and approached the black sedan that was parked at the curb. Dr. Okafor was in the front seat. He had insisted on accompanying Clara, not out of medical necessity, but out of genuine affection. Over the weeks of therapy, he had developed a deep respect for this woman's quiet courage, and he wanted to be there for this moment. In the back seat, barely visible through the tinted windows, was Clara. Vincent opened the door and leaned down. "Clara," he said gently, "everyone is inside. The music is playing. The harbor looks beautiful tonight. And there is a room full of people who are about to remember why Red Hook is the best neighborhood in Brooklyn." A pause. Then Clara's voice, thin but steady. "I haven't been in a room with more than 2 people in over a year. No. I might freeze. I might not be able to do this." "You might," Vincent agreed. "And if you do, we leave. No questions, no judgment. I'll have you home in 10 minutes. But I don't think you'll freeze, Clara. I think you're going to walk into that room and remind every person in it what strength looks like." Another pause, longer this time. Then the rustle of fabric, the click of a seatbelt being unfastened, and Clara Mancini stepped out of the car and into the amber glow of the warehouse. Lights. She was breathtaking. The emerald dress caught the light like a living thing, flowing around her frame with a grace that concealed the brace underneath, and the walker that she was leaving behind in the car, having decided, against Dr. Okafor's cautious advice, to use a cane instead. Her silver hair gleamed under the lights, styled to perfection, framing a face that had been transformed not by heavy makeup, but by Renata's expert touch, subtle contouring that restored the definition that months of illness had softened, a warm lip color that brightened her complexion, and eyes that had been gently enhanced to draw attention to their deep, expressive brown. And at her ears, catching the light with every slight movement of her head, were Angela Corsetti's pearl earrings. Vincent offered his arm and Clara took it. They walked together toward the entrance, and Vincent matched his pace to hers, not slowly enough to draw attention to her difficulty, but carefully enough to provide steady support. Lucia walked on Clara's other side, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, far enough to give her space. They reached the door. The string quartet was playing something soft and elegant. Vivaldi, Clara thought, though she could not be sure. Vincent looked at her. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a breath. She straightened her spine as much as her damaged body would allow, lifted her chin and said, "I've been ready for 14 months. I just didn't know it." They stepped inside. The reaction was not immediate. It built. First, it was the people nearest the door. A few turned, saw Vincent, began the customary nod of acknowledgement, and then stopped. Their eyes moved to the woman on his arm, and there was a beat of confusion, and who was she? Followed by a beat of recognition, and wait, is that? Followed by something that spread through the room like a wave, table by table, face by face, until the string quartet faltered and went silent because the musicians themselves had turned to look. Clara Mancini. Clara Mancini was here. Clara Mancini was walking. Clara Mancini looked. She looked. The room was not silent exactly. It was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. It was not a polite social clap. It was a slow, deliberate, reverential clap, the kind that says, "I see you, and I honor what it took for you to be here." Another pair of hands joined in, then another, and another, until the entire room was applauding. Not in the thunderous, boisterous way that audiences applaud a performance, but in that quieter, deeper way that people express admiration for something they recognize as genuinely extraordinary. Clara stopped walking. Her hand tightened on Vincent's arm, and for a moment Lucia was certain that this was where it would all fall apart, that her mother would turn and flee, that the wall would go back up and the curtains would close again. But Clara did not flee. She stood in the center of that room, in that emerald dress with those pearls catching the light, and her silver hair framing a face that was trembling with the effort of holding itself together, and she looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, friends, strangers, all of them looking at her with an expression that she had not seen directed at herself in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like. They saw her, not the invalid, not the woman who had disappeared. They saw Clara. And in their eyes, she saw a reflection of herself that was different from the one in the mirror of her dark bedroom. She saw a woman who had survived. The tears came then. She did not try to stop them. They ran down her carefully made-up cheeks, and Renata, who was watching from across the room with her own eyes glistening, made a mental note that she had used waterproof everything for exactly this reason. Vincent leaned close to Clara's ear and said very quietly, "Welcome back." She laughed. It was a watery, overwhelmed, slightly hysterical laugh, but it was a laugh, and it was the most beautiful sound Lucia had ever heard. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream. Vincent led Clara to the head table, where a chair with additional cushioning and support had been discreetly arranged. She sat down and was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, old clients who remembered her dresses, neighbors who had worried about her, young women who had heard stories about the legendary seamstress of Van Brunt Street but had never met her. Mrs. Gianelli, who ran the Italian bakery on Coffee Street and who had been Clara's neighbor for over 15 years, came over and took both of Clara's hands in her own weathered, flour-dusted grip. "Clara," she said, tears streaming unabashedly down her round face. "My God, Clara, look at you." "I know," Clara said, and she meant it in both the humble and the proud sense of those words. "I know." Throughout the evening, Clara received visitors at her table like a queen, holding court, and the remarkable thing was that it did not feel forced or performative. It felt natural. This was a woman who had spent her life connecting with people through the intimate act of creating beauty, and now that she was back in a room full of people, that instinct, that gift, came flooding back. She asked about their lives. She remembered their children's names, their health issues, the small dramas and triumphs that make up the fabric of a neighborhood. She complimented the Women on their outfits with the trained eye of a professional, noting a well-chosen color here, a flattering cut there. She even critiqued a few, gently and humorously. "Darling, that hemline is doing you no favors. Bring it in 2 inches and you'll knock everyone dead." And the recipients of this critique were so delighted to have the old Clara back that they thanked her profusely. Lucia sat at the next table, watching, and she thought about the months of darkness, the closed curtains, the whispered, "I'm tired, Lucia, I'm just so tired." The woman she saw now, animated and bright-eyed and laughing with Mrs. Gianelli about something that had happened at church, seemed like a different person entirely. But she was not. She was the same person. She had always been the same person. She had just needed someone to remind her. At 9 o'clock, Vincent stood and addressed the room. He did not use a microphone. His voice carried naturally, a product of decades of commanding attention in rooms of various sizes and varying legality. "Every year," he began, "we come together at this gala to celebrate our community. We raise money, we eat good food, we remind ourselves that Red Hook is not just a place on a map, it's a family. And like any family, we are only as strong as our willingness to take care of each other." He paused, and his eyes found Clara. "This year, I want to take a moment to honor someone who has been a part of this family for decades. A woman who spent her life making other people feel beautiful, and who, when life knocked her down, had the courage, and with a little help from her friends, to get back up." He extended his hand toward Clara. "Ladies and gentlemen, Clara Mancini." The room erupted. This time the applause was thunderous, accompanied by cheers and whistles, and the sound of Mrs. Gianelli blowing her nose with the force of a foghorn. Clara, who had been expecting a quiet mention at most, looked genuinely stunned. She gripped the arms of her chair, and for a moment it seemed like she might not be able to stand. But then she reached for her cane, planted it firmly on the ground, and rose to her feet. The movement was slow and effortful and visibly painful, but she did it with a dignity that silenced the room. She stood there in her emerald dress, with her silver hair and Angela's pearls, and the tears still drying on her cheeks, and she was the most beautiful woman in the room. Not because of the dress or the hair or the makeup, but because of what she represented, the stubborn, irrational, magnificent human refusal to be defeated. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "I didn't think I would ever be in a room like this again. I didn't think I deserved to be. But I learned something these past few weeks." She looked at Vincent, then at Renata, who was openly crying in the back, then at Dr. Okafor, who was beaming with professional pride and personal joy, and finally at Lucia, whose face was a masterpiece of barely contained emotion. "I learned that sometimes, when you can't find the light on your own, you have to let other people carry it for you, not because you're weak, but because that's what the light is for." The room was silent for the space of a heartbeat, and then the applause returned louder than before, and Clara Mancini sat back down and buried her face in her hands and wept. Not the tears of the lonely, diminished woman who had stared at her ceiling for 14 months, but the tears of a woman who had found her way back to herself and was overwhelmed by the beauty of the view. The weeks that followed the gala were, in many ways, more important than the event itself. Because a single night, no matter how transformative, is just a night. What matters is what happens after the lights go down, and the guests go home, and the emerald dress goes back in the closet. What happened was this. Clara Mancini kept going. She continued her physical therapy, with Dr. Okafor, graduating from the walker to the cane and then, eventually, to a careful, measured independence that allowed her to navigate her apartment without assistance. The pain did not disappear. It never would. The doctors had been clear about that. But it became manageable, something she could live alongside rather than something that consumed her entirely. She started leaving the apartment, short trips at first, a walk to the end of the block, a cup of coffee at the cafe on the corner, a slow stroll through Coffee Park where the kids still played and the pigeons still congregated, and the old men still argued about baseball with the same passion they had been arguing about baseball for 40 years. Each outing was an act of courage, a small defiance against the gravity that had pinned her to that bed, and each one made the next one easier. And then, in November, something happened that nobody had anticipated. Clara received a phone call from a woman named Helen Park, who ran a non-profit organization called Thread by Thread that provided job training and creative therapy to women recovering from long-term illness and injury. Helen had heard about Clara through the neighborhood grapevine. The gala story had spread far beyond Red Hook, carried by social media posts and local news features, and the simple, powerful mechanism of people telling other people about something that had moved them. And she had a proposition. "We have a workshop space in Sunset Park," Helen explained. "Sewing machines, fabric, tools, and everything a seamstress would need. And we have women who need someone to teach them, not just the craft, but the feeling that they can create something beautiful with their own hands." Clara was quiet for a long time after Helen finished speaking. Lucia, who was sitting nearby and could hear both sides of the conversation, held her breath. "I can't do what I used to do," Clara said finally. "My hands aren't as steady. My back can't handle long hours at a machine." "I'm not asking you to do what you used to do," Helen replied. "I'm asking you to do something new." Clara looked at Lucia, and something passed between mother and daughter, a silent conversation that lasted only a moment, but encompassed 14 months of darkness, 6 weeks of transformation, one unforgettable night, and all the uncertain, hopeful days that lay ahead. "When do I start?" Clara asked. She started the following week. 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, Lucia or sometimes Sophia would drive Clara to the Thread by Thread workshop in Sunset Park, where a group of 8 to 12 women recovering from accidents, from illness, from the aftermath of difficult life circumstances, gathered around long tables cluttered with fabric and thread, and the shared understanding that healing sometimes comes in stitches. Clara was not the same teacher she would have been before the fall. She was better, because she understood something now that she could not have understood before, the particular loneliness of being trapped in a body that no longer cooperates, the specific despair of watching your identity erode, and the almost unbearable tenderness of being helped back to yourself by people who refuse to give up on you. She brought that understanding to every interaction with her students, meeting each woman not as a charity case or a project, but as a fellow traveler on a road she knew intimately. She taught them to measure and cut and pin and stitch, yes, but she also taught them to look in the mirror and see not what was broken but what remained. She would sit beside a woman who was struggling with a seam and say, "Don't rush it. Take your time. The fabric knows when you're forcing it." And the woman would understand that Clara was not just talking about fabric. Renata continued to visit Clara every few weeks, maintaining her hair and her appearance, but also maintaining the friendship that had developed between them. They would sit together in Clara's living room. Clara had moved to the living room by then, claiming the armchair by the window as her throne, and talk about everything from hairstyling techniques to philosophy to the profound strangeness of being alive. "You know what I've realized?" Clara said one afternoon, sipping tea while Renata trimmed her ends. "What's that?" "That gala, the dress, the whole transformation. It wasn't really about how I looked. I mean, it was. It started there. But what it was really about was someone saying, you are worth the effort. That's what Vincent did. That's what you did. You all said, we're going to put in the effort because you are worth it. And that was the real transformation. Not the hair, not the makeup. The fact that someone showed up and refused to let me disappear." Renata nodded and said nothing for a moment, because some truths are too important to clutter with words. Vincent, for his part, maintained a respectful distance after the gala. He had done what he set out to do, and he was not a man who sought recognition or emotional return on his investments, but he kept tabs on Clara's progress through the neighborhood network, and occasionally a gift would arrive at her apartment. A bolt of fabric from a supplier in Florence, a book about fashion history, a handwritten note that said simply, "Angela would have loved your class." One evening in late December, as the first real snow of the winter was falling over Red Hook, Lucia came home from work to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a measuring tape draped around her neck and a sketch pad open in front of her. She was drawing, rough, confident lines that were unmistakably the beginnings of a dress pattern. "What are you doing?" Lucia asked, shaking snow from her coat. Clara looked up, and her eyes were bright in a way that Lucia had not seen since before the fall. Not just present, but alive. "I'm designing a dress," she said, "for a woman in my class named Margaret. She has a daughter getting married in the spring, and she wants to make the dress herself, but she needs a pattern." Clara tapped her pencil against the sketch pad. "The daughter wants something modern, but Margaret is traditional. So I'm working on something that splits the difference, a classic silhouette with a contemporary twist." Lucia leaned over and looked at the sketch. It was good. It was more than good. It was beautiful. Clean lines, elegant proportions, the unmistakable mark of a woman who understood not just how clothing was constructed, but how it made people feel. "Mum," Lucia said softly. "Welcome back." Clara smiled, that same full, unguarded smile that had appeared in her dark bedroom 6 months earlier, the one that Renata had coaxed out with patient kindness and careful scissors. "I never left," she said. "I was just taking a very long nap." And Lucia laughed, and Clara laughed, and outside the window, the snow continued to fall on Red Hook, covering the old and the new, the broken and the mended, the lost and the found, in a blanket of white that made everything look like it had been given a fresh start. There is a temptation in a story like this to give Vincent Corsetti too much credit, to paint him as the hero who swept in and saved the damsel. But that would be a simplification, and simplifications are the enemy of truth. Vincent did not save Clara Mancini. What Vincent did was create the conditions for Clara to save herself. He recognized something that most people, even well-meaning people, miss, that sometimes a person who has withdrawn from the world does not need to be pulled back in. They need to be reminded that the world is still worth coming back to, and then they need to be given the tools to make the journey on their own terms. The hair, the makeup, the dress, the gala, these were not the transformation. They were the invitation. They were the message delivered in emerald silk and silver hair, and Angela Corsetti's pearls that said, "You are not invisible, you are not forgotten, you are not over." And it was Clara, fragile, scared, in pain, heartbreakingly brave Clara, who accepted the invitation and did the actual work of coming back to life. As for Vincent, the neighborhood continued to see him as it always had, a complex figure, a man of contradictions, a person whose methods were questionable, but whose heart, when it mattered most, was genuine. He continued to run his businesses, attend his galas, sit in his pew at Our Lady of Grace on Sundays. He continued to be the man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, the man who could make things happen with a phone call, the man who existed in the space between light and shadow, that is the natural habitat of certain kinds of American power. But the people closest to him, Tommy, Sophia, the inner circle that saw him unguarded, noticed a change after the gala. A softness that had not been there before. A tendency to pause during conversations and look out the window with an expression that suggested he was seeing something far away and beautiful and sad. When Tommy asked him about it once, gently and with the cautious respect that their decades of partnership had earned, Vincent simply said, "I gave Angela's pearls to Clara." Tommy understood. The pearls had been the last physical connection to Angela, the last tangible piece of the life they had shared, and by giving them away, Vincent had not discarded that connection. He had transformed it. He had taken something that belonged to death and given it to life, and in doing so, he had found a kind of peace that all his money and power and influence had never been able to buy. Clara's class at Thread by Thread grew. Women came from all over Brooklyn, some from as far as Queens and the Bronx, drawn by the reputation that spread through the quiet, persistent channels of community word of mouth. Clara Mancini, they said, the seamstress who came back, the woman who disappeared into a dark room for 14 months and emerged in an emerald dress and stunned an entire room. She teaches sewing, they said, but really she teaches something else. What she taught was this: That beauty is not a luxury. It is a necessity. That taking care of your appearance is not vanity, but an act of self-respect, a way of telling the world, and more importantly, telling yourself, that you are still here, still present, still worthy of attention and care. She taught that healing is not linear, that there are good days and terrible days and days when the most you can manage is getting out of bed and brushing your teeth, and that all of those days count. She taught that asking for help is not weakness, that accepting kindness is not charity, that allowing other people to see you at your worst is an act of courage that makes it possible for them to help you find your best. And she taught it all through the medium of fabric and thread, through the ancient meditative act of creating something beautiful with your own two hands, through the magic, not supernatural magic, but the real human magic, of a woman who measures you for a dress, and in doing so, takes the measure of your soul. Spring came to Red Hook the way it always does, tentatively at first, with pale sun and stubborn wind, and then all at once, with blossoms exploding from the trees in Coffey Park and the harbour shimmering like a vast blue promise. Clara walked through the neighbourhood most mornings now, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk, her silver hair catching the light, her face lifted toward the sky with an expression of quiet, fierce gratitude. People greeted her as she passed. The guy at the bodega on Van Brunt always had her coffee ready, black, no sugar, the way she liked it. Mrs. Gianelli would wave from the bakery window and sometimes come out with a fresh cannoli that Clara always protested she did not need, but always ate. The kids in the park would sometimes stop their games and watch her go by with the curious, unself-conscious stares of children who recognize significance even when they cannot name it. One morning in April, Clara stopped in front of the building that had once housed her shop. The craft beer taproom was still there, with its chalkboard menus and Edison bulbs and clientele of young professionals nursing IPAs. Clara stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time, and Lucia, who happened to be walking with her that morning, prepared herself for sadness, for nostalgia, for the bittersweet ache of a life that had been lost. But Clara surprised her. She looked at the taproom and she smiled and she said, "Good. It should be something new. That's how neighborhoods work, that's how life works, things change, and the only question that matters is whether you change with them or get left behind." She turned and continued walking, her cane tapping, her shoulders straight, her emerald-worthy posture, defying every medical prognosis that had predicted she would never stand this tall again. And Lucia walked beside her and thought about all the forces that had conspired to bring them to this moment. A loose step, a fall, 14 months of darkness, a powerful man with a broken heart, a hairstylist with a gift for healing, a pair of pearl earrings, an emerald dress, and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent human refusal to be defeated. She thought about the title that the local newspaper had given to the story when they covered the gala, "The Boss Who Worked a Miracle," and she thought about how wrong it was and how right it was, and how the truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Because the miracle, if you could call it that, was not something that Vincent Corsetti had performed upon Clara Mancini. The miracle was something that had happened between them, and around them, and because of them, a collaboration of kindness and courage, and the simple, radical belief that every human being, no matter how broken, no matter how lost, no matter how far they have retreated into the dark, deserves the chance to step back into the light and be seen. And Clara Mancini, walking through the spring streets of Red Hook with the sun on her silver hair and the memory of a standing ovation still warm in her heart, was living proof that the miracle works. Margaret's daughter's wedding took place on a Saturday in May, in a small garden venue in Park Slope, that was draped in white flowers and bathed in golden afternoon light. The dress, the one that Clara had designed and that Margaret had stitched with her own hands under Clara's patient guidance, was a triumph. A floor-length gown in soft ivory with delicate lacework along the bodice, a flowing skirt that moved like water, and a back detail inspired by Clara's own signature style, a row of tiny hand-sewn buttons that ran from the nape of the neck to the small of the back, each one covered in the same fabric as the dress, each one a small testament to the care and craft that had gone into its creation. When the bride walked down the aisle, Margaret, sitting in the front row in her own new outfit, also made by her own hands under Clara's tutelage, wept openly and without shame. And Clara, who had been invited as a guest of honor and who was sitting 2 rows back in a chair that had been specially arranged for her comfort, watched the scene with eyes that were both full and clear. This was what she had lived for. This was what she had come back for. Not the gala, not the applause, not the emerald dress or the pearl earrings, though all of those things had played their part. She had come back for this, for the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing a woman she had taught create something beautiful with her own hands, for a bride who would walk through the most important door of her life, wrapped in the love and craftsmanship of her own mother. After the ceremony, the bride found Clara and hugged her, carefully mindful of her fragile frame, and said, "Thank you, my mum told me everything. She said you taught her that every stitch is a prayer." Clara looked at this young woman, radiant and trembling with the enormity of the day, and she thought of all the brides she had dressed over the years, all the tears she had witnessed, all the moments of pure, uncomplicated joy that she had been privileged to be a part of. And she thought of her own dark room, her own drawn curtains, her own conviction that all of that was over. "Every stitch is a prayer," she confirmed, "and every woman deserves to feel like the most beautiful version of herself at least once in her life." The bride laughed and cried at the same time, and Clara patted her hand and sent her back to her new husband, and then she sat in her chair and watched the celebration unfold around her, the dancing, the toasts, the laughter, the tears, and she felt something that she could only describe as wholeness, not the absence of pain, not the erasure of everything she had lost, but a fullness that encompassed all of it, the suffering and the healing, the darkness and the light, the fall and the rise, and found, in the totality of the experience, something that looked very much like peace. 2 years later, in the autumn of 2024, Red Hook held its annual Harvest Gala once again. The venue was the same, the format was the same, the string quartet was the same, but this year, there was a new feature, a fashion show. It had been Clara's idea, proposed to the planning committee with the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that the best ideas are the ones that scare you slightly. The show would feature garments created entirely by the women of Thread by Thread, designed and sewn under Clara's guidance, modeled not by professionals, but by the women themselves. Vincent, still the honorary chairman, had approved the idea without hesitation. "Whatever Clara wants," he told the committee, "make it happen." The show was scheduled for 9 o'clock after dinner and before the silent auction, and as the hour approached, a nervous energy filled the warehouse that was different from the usual gala excitement. Behind a makeshift curtain at the far end of the space, 12 women were getting ready, adjusting hemlines, smoothing fabric, checking mirrors, and trying not to hyperventilate. Clara was in the middle of them, seated in her chair because standing for long periods was still difficult, but commanding the space with the authority of a general preparing troops for battle. She moved from woman to woman, checking details, offering reassurance, straightening a collar here and adjusting a seam there, with hands that trembled slightly but still knew exactly what they were doing. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying over the rustle of fabric and the murmur of nerves, "when you walk out there, you're not just wearing a dress. You're wearing everything you've survived, everything you've learned, everything you've become, and that is the most beautiful thing in the world." Renata was there too, handling hair and makeup for all 12 women with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. She had trained 3 assistants from a local beauty school to help her, and they moved through the group like a well-oiled machine, a touch of color here, a final spray there, a whispered word of encouragement that was worth more than all the products in the world. At 9 o'clock, the lights in the warehouse dimmed. The string quartet fell silent. A spotlight appeared at the far end of the room, and a hush descended over the 250 guests who were seated at their tables, wine glasses paused halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. And then the music began, not the quartet, but a recorded track that Clara had chosen herself. It was instrumental, warm and soaring, The kind of music that makes you feel like you are watching something important, something that you will remember for a long time. The first woman to step through the curtain was Margaret. She was wearing a creation of her own design, a deep burgundy dress with flowing sleeves and an asymmetrical hemline that she had spent 3 months perfecting. She walked slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to savor every step. And as she emerged into the spotlight, the room responded with an intake of breath that was almost audible. One by one, the women came through, a retired schoolteacher in a cobalt blue pantsuit that she had designed to accommodate her wheelchair, with a matching head wrap that framed her face like a crown. A former restaurant worker who had suffered a severe burn to her arm and who wore a dress with dramatic flowing sleeves of her own invention that turned the concealment of her scars into a design element. A young mother who had been through a difficult period of postpartum recovery and who had channeled her experience into a dress that was both structured and soft, both protective and open, like the armor of a woman who has learned to be strong and vulnerable at the same time. Each woman told a story with her garment, and the audience received each story with the respect and emotion it deserved. There were tears throughout the room, the kind of tears that come not from sadness, but from the overwhelming experience of witnessing human resilience made visible, made tangible, made beautiful. Clara watched from behind the curtain, tears running silently down her own cheeks, and she thought of the 14 months she had spent in the dark, and she thought of Vincent's question. "When was the last time your mother felt beautiful?" And she thought of the answer, which she now understood was not a date or an event, but a decision. The last time she felt beautiful was the moment she decided to try again. And every moment since then had been a confirmation of that decision, a stitch in the ongoing garment of her life, a thread connecting who she had been to who she was becoming. The last garment in the show was special. It was not modeled by a student, but by Clara herself. Marcus Chen had designed it in collaboration with her, a silver-grey gown that matched her hair, simple in its lines but extraordinary in its craftsmanship, with hand-embroidered details along the bodice that Clara had stitched herself over the course of several painstaking weeks. Her ears were Angela's pearls. In her hand was her cane, which had been custom-wrapped in the same silver fabric as the dress, transforming a medical necessity into a fashion statement. She stood up from her chair. She took a breath. She stepped through the curtain. The spotlight found her and the room exploded, not with the slow, reverent applause of 2 years ago, but with a roaring, standing, full-throated celebration that shook the windows and sent the string quartet scrambling to join in. With an impromptu rendition of something triumphant, people were on their feet. Mrs. Gianelli, who was screaming something in Italian that was probably inappropriate for mixed company. Tommy Delaney, who was clapping so hard his palms were red. Dr. Okafor, who was standing at the back of the room with a professional assessment of Clara's gait and a personal assessment that involved a great deal of blinking to keep his eyes clear. Renata, who had emerged from behind the curtain and was now leaning against the wall, mascara running down her cheeks in artistic streaks that she would later claim were intentional. Lucia, who was sitting at the head table with her hands pressed to her heart, and her face illuminated by a joy so bright it could have lit the room all by itself. And Vincent. Vincent was standing at the back, in his usual midnight blue suit, his silver tie, his polished shoes. He was not clapping, he was simply watching, with an expression on his face that was impossible to categorize. Pride, gratitude, grief, peace, all of it mixed together in the complicated cocktail of a man who had lived a complicated life and who had, in the end, managed to do something that was uncomplicated and good. Clara walked the length of the room. She walked slowly with her cane tapping its steady rhythm on the polished floor, and she did not hurry, and she did not falter, and she did not look anywhere but straight ahead, because she knew where she was going, and she knew who she was, and that knowledge was more beautiful than any dress, more luminous than any pearl, more powerful than any empire that any boss had ever built. When she reached the end of the runway, she stopped and turned to face the room. The applause continued, relentless and warm, and Clara stood in it like a woman standing in the rain after a long drought, not just enduring it, but absorbing it, letting it soak into every part of her, the dry and the damaged, and the still healing parts that would never be quite the same, but that were at last alive. She raised her hand and the room gradually fell silent. And then Clara Mancini, in her silver dress and her pearl earrings and her silver hair and her eyes that held the memory of darkness and the promise of light, said the truest thing she had ever said. 2 years ago I was lying in a dark room, convinced that my life was over. I was convinced that I had nothing left to offer, nothing left to give, nothing left to be. And if it were not for the people who refused to accept that, my daughter who never stopped coming to my room, Renata who taught me that caring for myself was not vanity but courage, Marcus who made me a dress that made me feel like a queen, Dr. Okafor who celebrated every inch of progress, Vincent Corsetti who looked at a broken woman and saw someone worth fighting for, and all of you who showed up and clapped and cried and made me feel like I mattered. She paused, and her voice, which had been steady, now trembled with the weight of what she was about to say. I used to think that beauty was something you created, that it was about fabric and thread and the skill of your hands. But I was wrong. Beauty is something you receive. It's the gift that other people give you when they refuse to let you disappear. And the most beautiful thing in the world is not a dress or a hairstyle or a perfect face, it's a second chance. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of recognition, full of the shared human experience of having been broken and having been put back together. Not perfectly, but enough to stand, enough to walk, enough to look in the mirror and say, I'm still here. And then the applause came again, and this time it did not stop for a very long time. If you watched this entire story until the very end, then you are the kind of person who understands that real strength is not about never falling down. It is about getting back up, with grace. If you are that person, please leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so that I can know who you are and who truly appreciates the stories we share on this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now if you have not already, because every week we bring you stories like this one, real, raw, and deeply human stories that will move you in ways you did not expect. Tap the like button so this story can reach more people who need to hear it, and share it with someone who might be going through their own dark room right now, someone who needs to be reminded that it is not over, that the light is still there, and that sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to let you disappear. Until next time, take care of each other, because that is the real miracle, not the dress, not the gala, not the transformation. The miracle is showing up for someone when they cannot show up for themselves, and that is something every single one of us has the power to do.